Mundane stellar astrology. The ancient science of Hermes on the secret connections between the stars and their reflections on earthly beings and Eve. Introduction. Things are united by invisible bonds. You cannot pluck a flower without disturbing a star. Galileo Galilei. For some strange reason, the techniques of mundane astrology that we have inherited from tradition are not the most suitable ones to explain and predict events, because they actually catch only the last links of the chain of celestial causes that are at the base of them. In fact, the first causes of all events are always and only in the eighth sphere. That is in the sky of constellations and fixed stars, as is normal according to the traditional Aristotelian cosmology that establishes a precise hierarchy between the heavens. Every event has, and cannot but have, its first cause in the highest sphere, and so the 7 planets can only activate and manifest in a certain way the stellar archetypes. In this sense, the planets behave a little bit like the archons of the Gnostic cosmology, and the sun like the demiurge. In other words, the sun and the planets can only copy, in a more or less coarse way, these higher archetypal ideas, of which, according to the Gnostics, they have only a faint memory, and manifest them on this earth under the form of the beings that populate it and of the events that concern them. It is therefore necessary to adapt the techniques used in the mundane astrology in order to reflect this hierarchical order, and to reserve the usual techniques. Eclipses, great conjunctions, SYZYGY of the year or entrance of the sun in Aries, etc., only for the analysis of times and ways in which the stellar ideas will be activated and manifested on this earth. In this way also forecasts can become more precise and reliable, and it becomes also finally possible to distinguish epochal events from minor ones. Let us say at once, however, that for us the reduction of astrology to a predictive tool has been an integral part of its fall from a sacred discipline to a profane one. In fact, if we want to understand the true essence of a subject, we must go back to its origins and verify how it was understood and practiced then. In the case of astrology, it was originally a sacred subject that served to study the connections between the spiritual archetypal plane and the terrestrial plane and the ways in which the world of symbols manifests itself on the material plane. The goal of the Hermeticist is to discover the secret ties that bind earthly things both to each other and to their corresponding celestial counterparts. Once discovered these links, life changes completely. It becomes possible to do and conceive things and ideas that before seemed impossible. And everything begins to shine of its true essence, showing itself for what it is, also thanks to the discovery of the occult relations that weaves with other things. So astrology and Hermeticism are, and should become again, one and the same thing. The decadence of the matter began when the Hermeticists have begun to stop using astrology as their main tool, and astrologers have begun to disregard the Hermeticism, turning into self-styled soothsayers interested more than anything else to predict the future of their customers, often for venal reasons. But let's get to the content of the book. It begins by taking up the techniques of stellar astrology related to the precessional cycle of the stars, already exposed in the book Astronomia Sacra, Sacred Astrology, not yet available in English language, for those who have not read this book. But immediately after, we focus on each of these techniques in a different and much more analytical way, so as to show their use in normal mundane astrology, aimed at predicting and explaining the events that mark human history. Each of these techniques is applied to the analysis of various historical periods and events that are also followed in their secular evolution. thus highlighting how and why they should really become the basis of a true mundane astrology. It will be seen how with these techniques the really important events of history are much better highlighted, with respect to which the commonly used techniques are simply posed as activation factors of the protagonists of a certain epoch. In fact, logic requires us to start from the larger picture that highlights the fundamental things, and only then specify it with details. Instead, the exact opposite is commonly done. In this way it will be explained, step by step, the way to use in concrete, and not only in mundane astrology, the stopping points of the stars, their passage on the celestial equator, the way to interpret the equinoctial sky and the great importance of the parallels of declination between the stars themselves which, being much rarer and more lasting than those formed by the planets with each other and with the stars, highlight the true turning points of history. It is really strange that to date no astrologer knows and uses them as forecasting techniques. Only once the entire global stellar picture has been clarified in this way can we resort to the usual techniques of mundane astrology. Eclipses, annual syzygies, entrances of the sun, great conjunctions, to more precisely define the periods in which the most notable events will occur, who will manifest on Earth that particular dialogue between archetypes. Subsequently, a point of extraordinary importance will be illustrated for the astrologer hermeticist, but also simply for the astrologer who wants to learn how to do his job well. One of the most common mistakes made by practically everyone consists in not considering that the various parts of the starry sky, I mean by these constellations, parts of constellations, asterisms, and single stars, are not isolated, but communicate with each other, and therefore they must be conceived as part of a community, a bit like the men who live on this earth. And just as happens between men and between specific groups of men, between some of these parts of the sky there are privileged relationships, not necessarily linked to the spatial proximity between the stars in question. In the book we will see precisely what are the astronomical and astrological factors that highlight these family ties, thus also indicating the existence of similar ties existing between the things the world linked to those stars. This is the ancient Hermetic science of heaven-earth correspondences. It is a real science, based on rigorous criteria, which in this book we try to highlight and clarify, providing the scholar with a general method that he can then apply to each person, thing or event that it intends to study in depth. In the book this idea of extraordinary importance is not only developed theoretically, but also applied to concrete analyses. The stars are not bright dots that live in the sky isolated from each other. And it would be equally wrong to think that the only possible forms of family ties between stars are the traditional constellations. In a sense, we could say that the links between the stars are so dense and intricate that they can be assimilated to the internet. And what is even more extraordinary, these links actually reflect the occult ones that exist on this earth among the various things that are in affinity with these stars. Identifying these occult ties is, or should be, the preferred occupation of any true Hermetic astrology, because the destinies of things and the fruits of their mutual interaction depend on them. In other words, this is the field of study of true magic, to the point that the only practical magic that really works is precisely that based on the correct identification and use of these bonds. The reader will find many practical demonstrations of these principles in this book, and of the concrete identification of these links through certain procedures. You will see how identifying the stellar links activated by a certain chart is fundamental to understanding the effects it may have. And this applies to the individual birth chart as well. In fact, another novelty of this approach lies in the crossing of the traditional boundary between world and genethliacal astrology. We will see this by examining the birth charts of historical figures in reference to the sky of their era. If they have become prominent figures, it is precisely because their birth charts have allowed them to intercept the most remarkable features of the sky of their time, thus becoming a sort of representatives of the stars on Earth, that is, privileged vehicles of their manifestation. The great thing is that, in our own small way, each one of us is also the bearer of some of these potentialities of the sky of our era, whose effects are felt at a different level in the events of our private lives, particularly in the periods in which our individual astralities intercept these general potentialities. So, we should understand the importance of having a general picture of the stellar potentialities of our epoch. From its interaction with our individual birth chart depend also the most characteristic traits of our life and the main events that characterize it, and also our possibility to leave our mark in certain things. This is a completely new way of interpreting the birth chart, because, if we look closely, each birth does nothing more than activate in a certain way not only individual stars or parts of the sky, but also and above all these links that connect various parts of the starry sky. It is from these multiple and simultaneous activations of these parts of the sky by the wandering stars that the stories of each of us are born. The myths that most typically characterize our individual existence. We could compare the stellar archetypes to the corpus of tales, anecdotes and images used by troubadours to compose their poems. This corpus is potentially contained in the archetypes of the eighth sphere, and the troubadours, i.e., the planets, select some parts of it by composing and interweaving in different ways those tales of stellar origin. It is a bit what is done in music with the so-called variations on the theme. This is also true for world events. And it happens because most of the myths are a disguise of stellar tales, in the sense that they expose in the form of a tale certain properties of the stellar images, in particular from the point of view of their relationships with other stars and other images. The origin of many of these stories is lost in the mists of time, and many of them return in peoples far away from each other, with few variations. I think for example of some very ancient myths related to the Pleiades, Orion and the Ursa Major. These tales were handed down orally for immemorial time, until even those who handed them down were no longer aware of their true original meaning and their connection with the stars. I have dealt with these issues at length in the book El Hombre del Demiurgo. But the real point is that, beyond the specific content of each of these mythical tales, the real message underlying this whole tradition is much more radical and general. The ancients wanted to teach us that everything that happens on this earth is the fruit or manifestation of this series of interactions between the stars, which are real living beings that weave together various forms of relationships, just like humans and other beings on this earth. Therefore, the events of our individual and world life are not different from these mythical tales that describe stellar events and relationships, but are rather the manifestation of the same in a more coarse dimension. Each being and thing in the world is linked to the heavens by a series of these links that connect it to certain stars, groups of stars, etc., and each is so in its own way that also depends on the configurations of the sun, moon and planets with them. From this interweaving of connections, which depends on the individual birth chart, depends on the one hand the type of stellar tale. But perhaps it would be better to say tales, of which the life of each of us will become a manifestation, and on the other hand the way in which each of us will manifest the potential of this tale in an individual and entirely our own way. But whatever the nature of these individual tales may be, they are actually a manifestation of the events and relationships between the stars most closely related to us by birth and natural affinity. In other words, everything that happens in the terrestrial world is nothing but the manifestation of celestial events, or stellar events. In order to understand all this, it is necessary to start from the assumption that the sky and the stars are living beings. As the magical tradition teaches us, and as Cornelius Agrippa himself explicitly states in his occult philosophy, if you practice an analytical and hermetic astrology such as the one outlined in my last books, you can understand with dazzling evidence that the stars are not limited to exert a generic influence on this earth, being rather a precise and accurate mirroring, down to the smallest details, of every earthly event with the sky that accompanies it. It is precisely for this reason that my astrology is particularly analytical. In fact, my real purpose is to lay bare the real cosmic mechanisms of production of reality, and to this end it is necessary to study the starry symbols in all their twists and branches. In this way astrology can finally become what it should always be. And that is the sapiential matter par excellence, as the only one able to explain and demonstrate what is the true nature and origin of earthly reality. There is a single universal life that manifests itself simultaneously at all levels of being. We must start from this assumption to understand the nature of the relations that the planets themselves interact with each other through their motions, but also through their essential nature. Since the planets are at a hierarchically lower level than the stars, the type and nature of the relationships that can gradually form between them are also subordinated to the stellar archetypes. And so, when they form any kind of aspect between them, the effects of this interaction can only be particular manifestations of some of the potentialities of the stars with which they are in contact at that moment through some kind of configuration. In this way, those original stellar potentials are influenced by the nature and type of these planetary aspects, which thus convey them to us earthlings in a particular form. But behind these variable ways of activating those original influences, it is always possible to recognize the stellar archetypes that lie at the base. And their identification is of fundamental importance for the astrologer hermeticist, but also simply for the astrologer interested in making analyses and sensible predictions. Along this line, the book proceeds with a very detailed exposition full of historical examples of the technique of declination parallels formed by the stars between them. And in the last chapter, all the techniques presented in the book are used to glance at future decades and centuries. The ideas and techniques presented in this book are part of the attempt to outline a possible alternative to the common Ptolemaic solar astrology. The great Alexandrian astronomer is the reference point for all classical astrologers, but in reality his approach is the basis of modern astrology. I am not talking about the individual techniques, but precisely about the basic setting, starting with the exclusive adoption of the tropic zodiac, which over time has led astrologers to completely forget the zodiac of the constellations. The latter was perhaps the most serious crime committed in the history of astrology. The examples of this and my other books of stellar astrology demonstrate unequivocally that the iconic and symbolic power of the zodiac of the real constellations is extraordinary, and that any interpretation that does not take it into account deprives the possibility of understanding the true archetypal fabric, primordial, that lies behind every astrological chart, and which therefore allows us to identify the true stellar logos that underlies every manifestation on the terrestrial plane. If these books of mine have at least achieved the purpose of bringing the attention of some astrologers back to the zodiac of the constellations, I will already be satisfied. In reality, it is quite evident that the sun is not the ultimate instance of the universe, but only one star among many, which behaves like a demiurge towards his kingdom, which is the solar system. These are the considerations that led me to develop a stellar astrology that puts everything back in its true place. In the certainty that it is not a discovery, but simply a rediscovery of what once was already known. My latest books have been written precisely for the purpose of recomposing the foundations of this ancient science of the skies. They are full of examples and evidence that should convince even the most skeptical of astrologers, if only he were interested in discovering the truth. This too is well represented by the esoteric meaning, also highlighted by Guénon, of the phrase from the Gospels. The last will be the first. Whoever appears to be the first in the order of material manifestation, the sun, in our case, is actually the last one in the occult order behind this terrestrial theatre. First, much earlier, there are the stars, which shine only at night, when the sun disappears. Mundane Stellar Astrology book by Giacomo Albano, available on Amazon.